Morgan Jensen never expected to inherit her grandfather's old farmhouse on the outskirts of Oak Ridge Hills. The small parcel of land with its weathered barn and overgrown garden had somehow remained untouched, while a sleek, upscale housing development grew around it over the decades. After losing her apartment in the city due to skyrocketing rent, the inheritance couldn't have come at a better time. Morgan packed her modest belongings and moved to the countryside, excited to renovate the old place and start fresh. Little did she know that the Oak Ridge Hills Homeowners Association had been eyeing her grandfather's property for years, waiting for the opportunity to acquire it and complete their pristine neighborhood aesthetic. The day Morgan pulled up in her rusted blue pickup truck, several curtains twitched in the windows of the surrounding beige and white McMansions. She stepped out, boots crunching on the graveled driveway, and took a deep breath of country air. Her grandfather's house, her house now, stood defiantly amid the surrounding development, its faded red paint and wooden shutters a stark contrast to the cookie-cutter homes with their manicured lawns and identical landscaping. "It's perfect," she whispered, despite the sagging porch and overgrown wildflowers that had once been her grandmother's prized garden. As Morgan unlocked the front door with the old brass key, she noticed a sleek black SUV slowing down as it passed. The driver, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, stared openly at Morgan before speeding away. Morgan shrugged it off and stepped inside, greeted by dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows. The interior was exactly as she remembered from childhood summers: the creaky hardwood floors, the stone fireplace, and a hand-carved banister leading upstairs. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. Grandpa Walter had been living in a nursing home for the last 3 years before his passing. His personal items had already been packed away by Morgan's mother, leaving only the furniture and the essence of a life well lived. That night, as Morgan sat on the porch swing with a glass of lemonade, reviewing her renovation plans by the light of an old lantern, she noticed a piece of paper tucked under her truck's windshield wiper. Curious, she walked over to retrieve it. Notice of violation: unauthorized vehicle on premises. All resident vehicles must be registered with the HOA. Please refer to Covenant Section 8.3. Morgan frowned, turning the paper over. There was a phone number and the name Patricia Winters, HOA President, printed at the bottom. She crumpled the notice and tossed it into her recycling bin. Grandpa Walter had mentioned the persistent developers in his final years, but he'd never said anything about being part of a homeowners association. "They must have the wrong address," she murmured, returning to her swing. But as the evening deepened, Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Little did she know, this was just the first salvo in what would become a protracted battle for her right to live on her own land, her own way. 2 weeks after moving in, Morgan was building a chicken coop in her backyard when a stern-looking woman in an immaculate pantsuit marched up her gravel driveway. The woman's heels sank slightly into the soft ground with each determined step, and her expression soured as she glanced at the half-finished wooden structure. "Excuse me, but livestock is expressly forbidden per Section 12 of the HOA bylaws," the woman announced, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm Patricia Winters, president of the Oak Ridge Hills Homeowners Association." Morgan wiped sawdust from her hands onto her worn jeans and straightened up. She'd received 3 more violation notices since the first one, for her unkempt lawn, the vintage tractor parts she'd been cleaning on the front porch, and most absurdly, for the color of her mailbox. "Nice to meet you, Patricia. I'm Morgan Jensen, Walter Jensen's granddaughter," she said, extending a hand that Patricia pointedly ignored. "But I think there's been a misunderstanding." This property isn't part of your development. My grandfather owned this land outright long before Oak Ridge Hills was built. Patricia's professionally whitened smile tightened, not quite reaching her eyes. Oh dear, I'm afraid you're mistaken. When the development expanded 5 years ago, all surrounding properties were incorporated into our jurisdiction. It's in the county planning documents. Morgan frowned. That's not possible. My grandfather never would have agreed to that. Whether he agreed or not is irrelevant, Patricia said, waving a manicured hand dismissively. The zoning board approved the expansion. You're charming. Little Vombstead is now subject to our community standards, which, I must say, you've been flagrantly violating. Morgan's patience began to fray. Look, I have the deed and property records. This land has been in my family for over 60 years. We're not part of your HOA. Patricia's expression hardened. I can see Walter didn't fully brief you on the situation. We'll be issuing a formal violation notice. You have 7 days to remove that. Structure. And please do something about that eyesore of a truck. The neighbours are complaining. She reached into her designer handbag and extracted a business card and a thick booklet bound in fox leather with Oak Ridge Hills Community Standards and Covenants embossed in gold lettering. I suggest you familiarize yourself with our regulations. The fines for non-compliance can be quite steep, and they do compound daily. Patricia's voice had taken on an almost pleasant tone, as if she were doing Morgan a favour. Welcome to Oak Ridge Hills, Ms. Jensen. I'm sure once you adjust, you'll appreciate the benefits of living in such a prestigious community. Before Morgan could argue further, Patricia was already striding away, her phone to her ear. Yes, Mark, Morgan overheard her saying to someone. I've spoken with her. I think we'll need to escalate this one. Morgan stood in her yard, the HOA booklet heavy in her hand, a growing sense of indignation building in her chest. This was her land, her inheritance, and no matter what Patricia Winters believed, Morgan had no intention of letting some power-hungry HOA president dictate how she lived on it. Over the next month, Morgan received a barrage of violation notices for everything from her vegetable garden, unsightly landscaping, to the antique tractor her grandfather had left in the barn, which she occasionally used for yard work, prohibited vehicles. Each time she explained her property's independent status, the HOA simply doubled down. The mailbox became a daily source of dread, each envelope bearing the gold-embossed Oak Ridge Hills logo, containing a new complaint, a new demand, or an ever-increasing fine total that now exceeded $2,000. Morgan had tried calling the county zoning office, but was placed on an endless wait list for an appointment. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, while Morgan was repairing a section of the roof that had begun to leak during the previous night's rainstorm, the distinctive sound of a police siren caused her to look down from her perch. A patrol car pulled into her driveway, and a tired-looking officer stepped out, squinting up at her against the sunlight. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Rodriguez with the Oak Ridge PD. We've received a complaint about unauthorized construction. Do you have permits for that work you're doing?" Morgan carefully descended the ladder. "I'm just replacing some damaged shingles, officer. It's maintenance, not construction." Officer Rodriguez nodded, jotting something in his notepad. "And you are?" "Morgan Jensen. This is my property. I inherited it from my grandfather, Walter Jensen." Recognition flickered across the officer's face. Old Walter's place. I knew him. Good man. His expression softened slightly. "Look, Ms. Jensen, I've been called out here because the HOA claims you're violating building codes and their community standards. But I'm not part of their HOA." Morgan protested. showing him the deed she'd taken to carrying with her at all times. This property has never been incorporated into Oak Ridge Hills. Officer Rodriguez reviewed the document, then looked around at the stark contrast between Morgan's rustic farmhouse and the uniform development surrounding it. This isn't the first time I've been called to mediate these disputes. The president, Mrs. Winters, can be persistent. That's one word for it, Morgan muttered. The officer handed back her deed. No crime being committed here. Basic home repairs don't need permits in this county anyway. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, but paused. Just so you know, they'll probably keep calling us. They've done this before with other homeowners who don't comply. 3 days later, Officer Rodriguez was back, this time responding to complaints about excessive noise, when Morgan used a power saw to cut lumber for her porch repair. The following week, it was a call about hazardous materials when she was mixing compost for her garden. Each time, the officer explained to Patricia, who inevitably appeared to observe the proceedings from the edge of the property, that Morgan's activities were perfectly legal, and her property was indeed outside HOA jurisdiction. After the 4th visit in 2 weeks, Officer Rodriguez handed Morgan his card with his direct line scribbled on the back. Call me if they start harassing you in person. This is getting ridiculous. Thanks, Morgan said, tucking the card into her pocket. Does this happen often around here? More than you'd think, he replied grimly. Mrs. Winters has driven 3 families out of the neighbourhood this year alone. But they were actually in the HOA. Your situation is different. He glanced toward Patricia, who was sitting in her SUV at the end of the driveway, openly watching them. Be careful, Ms. Jensen. That woman doesn't like to lose. Frustrated by the constant harassment, Morgan visited the county records office and discovered something fascinating. Not only was her 5-acre property independent of the HOA, but according to the original survey maps, the HOA had been mistakenly enforcing rules on a small strip of land that technically belonged to our grandfather's property. This included the community garden the HOA had installed and the decorative fence they directed along what they thought was the boundary. Armed with this knowledge and documentation from the county assessor, Morgan began formulating a plan. She also learned that her grandfather had repeatedly refused lucrative offers to sell his land to the developers, something Patricia had never mentioned. The county records office was housed in the basement of a century-old courthouse, a labyrinth of filing cabinets and dust-covered boxes that seemed to stretch forever. Morgan had taken a day off from her remote graphic design work to dive into the property records, hoping to find something, anything, that would help her case. You're Walter Jensen's granddaughter. The elderly clerk, Mr. Finch, peered at her over wire-rimmed glasses. I remember when those developers started circling his place like vultures. Your grandfather was stubborn as an old mule. You knew him? Morgan asked, surprised. Everybody knew Walter. Mr. Finch chuckled, leading her to a back room filled with large map drawers. He used to bring homegrown tomatoes to everyone in this building every summer, and he fought those developers tooth and nail. For the next 3 hours, Morgan pored over property maps, deeds, and county commission minutes. Mr. Finch occasionally shuffled over with another relevant document, seemingly invested in her search. By mid-afternoon, she had assembled a complete picture, and it was more interesting than she'd anticipated. Look at this survey from 1975, Mr. Finch said, spreading out a large yellowed map, and compare it to the development plans from 2010. He overlaid a newer, crisper document. See that discrepancy? Morgan leaned closer. The boundary line of her grandfather's property extended almost 15 feet further than where the current HOA fence stood. They built on our land. Mr. Finch nodded. The survey stakes must have been moved during initial construction. It happens more often than you'd think. But legally, he tapped a gnarled finger on the older map. This is the official property line. So their community garden, that fancy entrance sign, and part of their decorative fence are all on my property. Morgan asked, excitement building. Technically, yes, and there's more. He pulled out a thick folder of correspondence. Your grandfather filed official protests when they first started building too close to his line. The developer promised to correct it, but never did. Walter's health started failing around then, so he couldn't follow up. Morgan flipped through the letters, her grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting detailing his frustration with the encroachment. The last letter was dated just weeks before his stroke. There's one more thing you should see, Mr. Finch said, his voice lowering conspiratorially. He produced a thin file containing offers from Oak Ridge Development Corporation to purchase Walter's property, the most recent just 6 months before his death, for nearly triple the market value. All were marked Regi Cite Edi in her grandfather's bold scroll. He could have been a wealthy man, Mr. Finch remarked. He already was, in the ways that mattered, Morgan replied softly, gathering the documents. Mr. Finch, can I get certified copies of all of these? As Morgan left the records office, arms full of documentation and mind racing with possibilities, she couldn't help but smile. Patricia Winters had no idea what was coming. At the next HOA meeting, which Morgan attended uninvited, causing quite a stir, she presented her findings to the entire board and attending homeowners. She revealed that the HOA had been trespassing on her property for years and had no jurisdiction over her land. The homeowners, many of whom had grown tired of Patricia's draconian enforcement, watched with growing interest. Patricia attempted to dismiss Morgan, but Officer Rodriguez, who happened to be in attendance as a resident, confirmed the property boundaries. Red-faced, Patricia accused Morgan of trying to destroy the community's aesthetic and property values. That's when Morgan made her proposal. She would allow the HOA to maintain their decorative installations on her land, but only if they signed a formal agreement acknowledging her property's independence and guaranteeing an end to all harassment. The Oak Ridge Hills Community Center was packed for the monthly HOA meeting. Morgan slipped in quietly, taking a seat in the back row, just as Patricia called the meeting to order. For 30 minutes, she listened to discussions about lawn watering schedules, the upcoming community picnic, and complaints about children's toys left in driveways. Finally, Patricia reached the open floor portion of the agenda. "I'd like to speak," Morgan said, standing before anyone else could. A ripple of whispers spread through the room as she walked to the front, carrying a large folder. Patricia's smile froze. "This meeting is for residents of Oak Ridge Hills, only Ms. Jensen." "That's actually what I'd like to address," Morgan replied calmly, opening her folder on the podium. She pulled out the first map and held it up. "This is the original survey of my property from 1975, certified by the County Assessor's Office." She proceeded to lay out her case methodically, projecting images of the documents onto the screen behind her. The residents leaned forward, increasingly engaged as Morgan explained how the HOA had built their prized community garden and ornate entrance sign on land that legally belonged to her. Additionally, Morgan continued, "I've confirmed with county zoning that my property was never incorporated into the Oak Ridge Hills development. The HOA has no legal authority over my land or how I choose to use it." Patricia stood abruptly. "This is preposterous. Our development plans clearly show." "Actually," a voice called from the middle of the room, "she's right." Officer Rodriguez stood up. I took the liberty of verifying these boundaries with the county myself after our multiple visits to Ms. Jensen's property. The survey markers were indeed incorrectly placed during development. Patricia's face flushed crimson. This is clearly an attempt to circumvent our community standards. Do you realize what will happen to our property values if we allow a farm in the middle of our neighborhood? She spat the word farm as though it were obscene. An older resident in the front row raised his hand. I've lived here for 15 years, and I remember Walter Jensen's place before all this was built. He was a good neighbor, kept to himself. Never bothered anyone. Others nodded in agreement. Morgan realized that many of the homeowners weren't as invested in Patricia's vision of suburban perfection as the HOA president herself. "I'm not here to cause problems," Morgan said, addressing the residents rather than Patricia. "I'm simply asking to be left alone to live on my property as my grandfather did." In exchange, she paused, meeting Patricia's furious gaze, "I'm willing to work out a reasonable arrangement regarding the portions of my land that the HOA is currently using." The room erupted in murmurs as Patricia repeatedly banged her gavel for order. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared. "Actually," said the HOA vice president, a mild-mannered man named Tom, "I move that we discuss Ms. Jensen's proposal immediately. This affects our budget and community planning." Several board members nodded in agreement. Outvoted, Patricia sank back into her chair as Morgan laid out her terms. With the HOA board reluctantly agreeing to her terms, Morgan executed the final part of her plan. She drafted a meticulous contract with her lawyer, one that acknowledged her complete ownership and independence, while granting the HOA limited easement rights for their existing installations on her strip of land. The contract included a clause requiring the HOA to pay a modest annual land use fee, and stipulated that any future complaints about her property would result in immediate termination of the agreement and removal of all HOA installations. Patricia was forced to sign it in front of the entire association. The morning of the contract signing dawned bright and clear. Morgan had spent the previous 2 weeks with a property lawyer recommended by Officer Rodriguez's brother-in-law. Together, they had crafted a document that was both ironclad and deliciously detailed in its malicious compliance. "You've really thought of everything," remarked her attorney, Ms. Castillo, as they walked into the community centre where the HOA board waited. "Most people just want the harassment to stop. You've turned this into an opportunity." Patricia sat at the centre of the board table, her posture rigid, and her signature pearl necklace clasped so tightly it seemed to be choking her. The HOA's attorney, a nervous young man clearly out of his depth, was whispering urgently in her ear. "Let's begin," Morgan said pleasantly, taking a seat across from Patricia. She slid copies of the contract across the table. "I believe everyone has had time to review the terms." The vice president, Tom, nodded. "We find them acceptable, given the circumstances." The terms were simple yet comprehensive. The HOA acknowledged that Morgan's property was completely independent of their jurisdiction. In exchange for allowing them to maintain their existing installations on her land, the entrance sign, decorative fence, and community garden, they would pay an annual fee of $1,200, exactly the amount Morgan had calculated they'd save by not having to relocate these features. Most importantly, the contract contained Clause 17, which Morgan had lovingly crafted. Any complaint, citation, or harassment regarding the Jensen property, whether from the HOA directly or through proxy agencies, such as municipal code enforcement, will constitute an immediate breach of this agreement, resulting in termination of all easement rights and removal of all HOA installations from Jensen property within 30 days, at the HOA's expense. Patricia's hand trembled slightly as she signed the document, her usual confidence shattered by the public defeat. Morgan signed with a flourish, her grandfather's old fountain pen leaving a bold blue signature. Over the following months, Morgan built her chicken coop, installed solar panels that Patricia had previously blocked for other residents, and even started a small farmers' market on weekends that became popular with the development's residents. The annual fees she collected went toward maintaining a small playground for neighbourhood children on the border of her property, something the HOA had promised but never delivered. Several residents, emboldened by Morgan's stand, began challenging other excessive HOA regulations. Tom, the vice president, led an initiative to revise the community standards to be more reasonable. Patricia found herself increasingly isolated in her hardline positions. 6 months after the contract signing, Patricia resigned from the board, citing personal reasons. She put her house on the market shortly afterward, unable to bear living next to what she called a mockery of proper suburban values. On the day Patricia's moving truck pulled away, Morgan sat on her porch swing, sipping homemade lemonade. Officer Rodriguez stopped by, now off duty and dressed in civilian clothes. "Heard the news?" he asked, accepting the glass of lemonade Morgan offered. "I did," she replied. "I almost feel bad for her." "Almost," he agreed with a smile. "You know, your grandfather would have loved this. He fought them for years." Morgan looked out over her thriving garden, the clucking chickens, and the children playing on the new swing set just beyond her property line. In the distance, Oak Ridge Hills residents were gathering for the weekend farmers' market she'd established. "He didn't fight hard enough," she said, raising her glass in a silent toast to the sky. "But he held on long enough to pass the torch. Sometimes that's all we can do."